In the summer of 1979, on a gravel road outside of Harlan County, Kentucky, a 38-year-old woman named Nettie Bowman paid $400 for a decommissioned smokehouse. A broken-down curing rack and 60 pounds of heritage Berkshire hog cuts that a retiring butcher named Eldon Price could not move before he closed his doors for good. Nobody in Harlan County wanted them. Not in 1979, not in coal country, not in a place where every man who mattered worked underground and every woman who mattered fed him when he came back up. The butcher, Eldon Price, was 74 years old and had been curing meat in that building since 1931. He had learned from his father, who had learned from his father before him, and that chain of knowledge that ran through that smokehouse was longer than the road it sat on. Eldon had no sons. He had 2 daughters, both of whom had moved to Cincinnati before Nixon was president, and neither of whom had any interest in what their father did with salt and smoke and time. When Eldon's wife, Florence, died in January of 1979, Eldon sat in the smokehouse for 3 days and then drove himself to the bank in Harlan and told the loan officer he was done. Nettie Bowman heard about the smokehouse from her neighbor Cleo, who heard it from the woman at the laundromat, who heard it from Eldon's niece, who had been trying to find a buyer for 6 weeks and was running out of patience. Nettie drove over on a Thursday morning in August. She parked her truck on the gravel shoulder and walked around the building twice before she went inside. What she found was not garbage. Most people who looked at that smokehouse saw a falling down structure with outdated equipment and a supply of meat cuts that nobody wanted to pay fair price for. Nettie saw something else. She had been looking for something else for 11 years. Eldon was inside when she came through the door. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, not doing anything in particular, just sitting the way a man sits when he has nowhere to be for the first time in his life. He looked up when she came in. "I heard you might be selling," she said. He looked at her the way old men look at young women who show up unannounced. Not unkind, just measuring. "You cook?" he asked. "I cure," she said. "Or I'm trying to learn." That stopped him. He had not expected that answer. He had not expected any answer that did not begin with, "How much or what would you take?" She spent 2 hours in that building. She looked at the hanging racks, the way the smoke vents were positioned, the age and type of hickory stored in the woodshed, out back. She tasted the last of the cured shoulder Eldon had put up the previous October. She asked him questions about salt ratios, about cure times, about what he did different in July versus December. Eldon answered all of them. He had not talked about these things to anyone in years, and somewhere in the middle of answering her third question, he forgot that he was supposed to be selling and started teaching instead. When she came back outside, she had a number in her head. "The equipment needs work," she said. "The rack on the south wall is warped past saving. 3, your vent covers are cracked." He nodded. He knew all of this. "I'll give you $400 for what's here. The cuts, the usable equipment, the hickory in the shed. I'll bring a trailer Saturday morning if that works for you." Eldon was quiet for a moment. He had been hoping for more. He had also been hoping, without knowing he was hoping, for someone to take this thing off his hands in a way that did not feel like throwing it away. "You know what you're doing?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But I will," he said. "Deal." They shook hands in the gravel. She came back Saturday with her husband's truck and a borrowed flatbed, and by Sunday evening there was a smokehouse worth of equipment sitting in the back half of the Bowman property on Clover Creek Road. Her husband, Gene Bowman, stood at the edge of the driveway and looked at the pile of iron and hickory and Berkshire cuts, and did not say anything for a long time. Gene was a patient man by temperament and a cautious man by upbringing, and he had been both of those things long enough to know that certain conversations with Nettie were best entered carefully. "What are you going to do with it?" he finally asked. "Cure meat," she said. He looked at her. "And sell it?" "Eventually." Gene took off his cap and turned it in his hands. He was a mechanic. He understood engines, tolerances, the logic of systems that had to work the first time or not at all. He did not understand the business she was describing, but he had been married to Nettie for 14 years, and he understood her well enough to know that the time to ask more questions was not tonight. "All right," he said. He put his cap back on and went inside. "Let me tell you about Nettie Bowman, because what she did with that smokehouse and those 60 pounds of Berkshire cuts over the next 12 years only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from." Nettie was born in 1941 in Pike County, Kentucky, the second of 4 children raised by a woman named Georgia Reese, who had kept a meat cellar, a kitchen garden, and a sewing room in a house with no indoor plumbing until Nettie was 10 years old. Georgia Reese was not a gentlewoman. She was not sentimental. She was efficient in the way that people who grow up without surplus are efficient, without waste, without apology, and with a precision that looked like artistry from the outside, but was really just survival organized into habit. Georgia cured her own pork. She had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, and so on back through a chain of Kentucky women who had understood that the difference between a family that ate well in February and a family that did not was the quality of what you put in the cellar in October. Georgia's hams were not like the hams in the grocery store. They were darker, firmer, with a depth of salt and smoke that did not dissipate when you sliced them. Neighbors brought Georgia their hams to finish cure. She charged them a small fee and kept her methods to herself. Nettie watched all of it. She watched the salt work into the meat. She watched the smoke move in the curing shed her father had built behind the house. She watched her mother make adjustments that she never wrote down. Adjustments based on the fat thickness of a particular hog, the humidity of a particular September, the way the wood was burning on a given afternoon. It was knowledge that lived in the hands and the eyes, not in books, and Nettie was old enough by the time she left Pike County to have absorbed most of it. She went to Eastern Kentucky University. She studied home economics, which in 1960 meant something broader and more practical than the name suggests. She was a good student. She had a boyfriend in Richmond, a pleasant young man from Berkshire County who wanted to teach school and settle down close to home. But it was a dry July, but in the spring of 1963 her mother had a small stroke that left her left hand unreliable, and Nettie came home for the summer to help with the canning and the garden and the meat cellar. Summer became fall. The boyfriend wrote through the winter and stopped writing by March. Nettie stayed. She married Gene in 1965. He was good. He was steady. He worked at the garage on Route 421 and kept the truck running, and did not ask her to be anything other than what she was. They had 2 children, a daughter named Kay and a son named Philip. And Nettie raised them in a house where the kitchen was the most serious room, and the back shed was where she went when she needed to think. She had kept her mother's curing methods alive. Not commercially, not in any way that made money. She put up her own hogs every November, cured the hams and shoulders the way Georgia had taught her, gave away more than she sold, and sold less than she should have. The neighbors who ate her ham did not forget it. They came back for more, and brought their neighbors, and brought their neighbors' neighbors. And by 1972, Nettie was turning people away, not because she lacked the knowledge, but because she lacked the space and the time and the legal standing to do it properly. She had been thinking about that problem for 7 years when she walked into Eldon Price's smokehouse. She had been reading in the meantime, not the popular food magazines, which in 1979 were mostly telling people to eat less fat and buy more convenience products. She had been reading agricultural bulletins from North Carolina and Virginia, states that still had working artisan ham operations. She had been reading about the Spanish jamon producers, the Italian prosciutto houses, the way the French thought about fermentation and curing and time. She had found, in a university library in Lexington, a 1954 monograph on the salt chemistry of dry-cured pork that had been written by a food scientist at Virginia Tech and never widely distributed. And she had read it so many times that the binding had cracked. What she understood, and what almost nobody in Harlan County understood in 1979, was that American cured meat had taken a wrong turn sometime around 1950. The industry had shifted to wet curing, to injected brines, to accelerated processes that cut the cure time from months to days. The product that came out was edible. It was safe. It was consistent. It was not ham. Not in the sense that Georgia Reese's ham or Eldon Price ham was ham. Not in the sense that something slow and dry and patient and smoke-finished over hickory for 5 months was ham. The old way had not been abandoned because it produced an inferior product. It had been abandoned because it was slow, and slow was expensive, and expensive was not what the post-war food industry wanted to be. Nettie believed the market had been misread, not everywhere, and not by everyone, but in the specific territory she was thinking about, the people who bought from the Harlan County farmers market, the people who drove 2 hours to get good country ham at Christmas, the people who had grown up eating the real thing and had never stopped wanting it. That market was real, and it was underserved, and it was not going away. She had known this for years. She had been waiting for the infrastructure to become available. Eldon Price's retirement had provided the infrastructure. That is why nobody in Harlan County understood the purchase. They were watching a woman spend $400 on an old man's junk. They were actually watching a woman execute a plan she had been developing since 1968, waiting for the right building, the right equipment, the right moment to come available. The smokehouse had not created the idea. The idea had been looking for the smokehouse for 11 years, and Eldon Price's grief had finally provided it. Let me tell you about the first 3 years, because this is where Nettie Bowman proved that preparation, patience, and willingness to be underestimated are worth more than capital, connections, and conventional wisdom combined. She spent the fall of 1979 getting the building right. She rebuilt the south wall rack herself, with Jean's help on the metalwork. She re-mortared the chimney. She replaced the cracked vent covers with ones she had made from salvaged cast iron. She drove to Eldon's house 3 times that winter, with questions she had thought of in the middle of the night, and Eldon answered every one of them over coffee at his kitchen table, grateful in the way that people are grateful when someone takes seriously the thing they have spent their life doing. She processed her first commercial batch in January of 1980. 8 hams, 2 shoulders, 4 bellies. She used her mother's salt cure with modifications she had derived from the Virginia Tech monograph, adjusted for the specific altitude and humidity of Harlan County. She hung them in the rebuilt smokehouse and started the hickory fire on a cold Tuesday morning, and then went home and waited. Her neighbor, a retired miner named Chet Dupree, stopped by in February to see what she was doing in that old building behind the house. She showed him. He looked at the hanging hams the way a man looks at something he does not quite understand. "You selling those?" he asked. "In about 4 months. Who's going to buy them?" "Anyone who's ever eaten real country ham." Chet said nothing more. He told his wife that evening that Nettie Bowman had gone a little strange, which his wife relayed to her sister, which traveled through 2 churches and a hair salon before it arrived. Slightly transformed at the Harlan County Farmers Market, where the consensus was that Jean Bowman's wife was trying to start some kind of business in a falling-down smokehouse with old Eldon Price's leftovers. And wasn't that something? She sold all 8 hams by June of 1980. She did not sell them at a discount. She priced them at what she believed they were worth, which was nearly 3 times what a grocery store ham cost. And she sold every one of them to people who had been waiting without knowing they were waiting for exactly this product. A restaurant in Lexington bought 2 of the shoulders. A woman in Corbin drove 90 minutes for one of the bellies. The checks came back clean. She reinvested everything. More hogs, more hickory, better sourcing. She found a small farm in Leslie County that was raising Berkshire cross hogs on pasture and making almost nothing from them because the commodity market did not care about breed or diet. She made a handshake deal to buy their whole annual output. The farmer, a quiet man named Theodore Vance, had never had anyone offer to buy his entire hog production at a fair price before. He shook her hand and did not ask many questions. By the end of 1981, Nettie was curing 40 hams a year. By 1983, it was 90. She hired a part-time worker, a young woman from down the road who was between jobs and learned quickly. She expanded the smokehouse by 12 feet on the east side. She had not borrowed any money. She had not taken on any partners. She had grown the operation entirely from what it produced, 1 batch at a time, 1 season at a time. The word spread the way good things spread, which is slowly and by mouth, and not in any way you can control or hurry, not dry. A food writer from the Lexington Herald who came out in the spring of 1982 and wrote a small piece in the weekend section. Nettie did not seek the coverage. The food writer had heard about her from the restaurant in Lexington and had driven down on a Tuesday without calling first. Nettie gave her a slice of the 8-month shoulder and a cup of coffee and answered her questions honestly, and the piece ran on a Sunday, and the phone rang for 2 weeks after. Her daughter Kay, who was 17 by then, answered most of those phone calls. Kay had her mother's head for numbers and her father's patience, and she had been watching the smokehouse operation with more attention than Nettie realized. Kay started keeping the order book that fall. She was still in high school. She kept the order book the way Nia kept the smokehouse, carefully, with nothing wasted and nothing left to chance. Here is the part that mattered, the part Nettie had been watching for, the part that did not show up in any of the food writer's numbers. The hogs from Theodore Vance's farm were different from the commodity hogs available through the conventional supply chain. They were slower growing, higher in intramuscular fat, raised on pasture and supplemented with the farm's own corn and whey. What that meant in practice was that the fat in the finished ham was different. It did not cook out the same way. It did not render the same way. It held the salt and smoked differently, carried the smoke differently, carried the flavor differently, produced a finished product that even a casual eater could distinguish from the industrial product after one bite. Nettie had suspected this would be true. She had read about it in the Virginia Tech monograph and in papers from Spanish curing houses that described the relationship between the Iberian pig's diet and the specific fatty acid profile of the finished jamon. She had not been able to prove it in 1979. By 1983, she did not need papers to prove it. She could prove it with a knife and a cutting board in about 30 seconds. She did not tell people this when they bought her hams. She let them eat and draw their own conclusions. The conclusions they drew were that her product was different, better, worth the price, worth the drive, worth telling someone about. That was enough. In 1985, she sold her first ham to a restaurant in Nashville. The chef there, a young man who had staged in France and come back with opinions about sourcing, had heard about her from the Lexington restaurant and driven to Harlan County on a Saturday, specifically to taste the product. He stood in Nettie's smokehouse for 2 hours asking questions that were more specific and more informed than any questions she had been asked before, and she answered all of them and showed him the Leslie County farm on a hand-drawn map. He bought 20 hams that day. He put them on his menu in October. By December, he had called 3 other chefs in Nashville and told them where the hams came from. The chef community moved faster than the civilian market. It was lateral movement, chef to chef, city to city, and it happened in 1985 and 1986 in a way that surprised Nettie and did not surprise her at all. She had known the product was good enough. She had not known how quickly the right people would find it once one of them had it in their hands. By 1987, Nettie Bowman was curing 230 hams a year, plus shoulders, plus bellies, and she had a waiting list. She had 3 part-time workers. She had dry July. She had not advertised once, had borrowed no money, and taken no outside investment, and expanded no faster than her own production could fund, which was a pace that felt frustratingly slow to the chefs who wanted more product and felt exactly right to Nettie, who had watched her mother run out of canned tomatoes in March too many times to confuse speed with wisdom. The men at the farmer's market, who had been watching all of this from a distance, had a variety of opinions. Some of them had revised their assessment of Nettie's sanity. Some of them had not. Chet Dupli, who had retired from the mine by 1986 and had more time for opinions, told anyone who would listen that Nettie had got lucky with the food writer, that it was publicity that had built the business, not the product, that Chet had eaten Nettie's ham twice and knew perfectly well. It was the best thing he had put in his mouth since Georgia Reese had been alive, was a detail he left out. Let me tell you about the fall of 1989, because this is where 12 years of quiet, patient, unfashionable work met a crisis that nobody in the American food industry saw coming, and almost everyone in Nettie's position failed. In the summer of 1989, a contamination scare in the commercial pork processing industry triggered federal inspections across multiple states. The details were complicated and the reporting was confused, but the effect on consumer behavior was not complicated at all. Pork sales dropped 30% nationally in the third quarter of 1989. Grocery store managers pulled product. Restaurants took pork off menus preemptively. The commodity hog market, which had already been operating on thin margins, went into freefall. Hog farmers across the Midwest were euthanizing animals they could not sell and could not afford to feed. In Harlan County, 3 small meat operations that had been trying to compete with Nettie in the regional market closed within 60 days of each other. They had been working on thinner margins, with cheaper sourcing, with less differentiated product, and when the consumer panic hit, they had nothing to offer that the consumer could not get anywhere else. Their product was not different enough from the supermarket product to survive the supermarket product's collapse. Nettie did not lose a single customer. She did not lose a customer because what she was selling was not what the public was afraid of. What the public was afraid of was industrial processing, mass-produced product, anonymous supply chains, things that happened in facilities too large to inspect adequately and too complex to trace. What Nettie was selling was a ham that came from a specific farm in Leslie County, raised by a specific man named Theodore Vance, cured by a specific process in a specific building on Clover Creek Road, by a woman whose customers had met her personally and watched her work. In September of 1989, when her competitors were closing their doors, Nettie's waiting list was longer than it had ever been. People who had been nervous about commercial pork were calling her. People who had read about the contamination scare and wanted to know exactly where their food came from were calling her. She could not fill all the orders. She did not have the capacity. She called Theodore Vance in October. He had weathered the crisis better than most, because Nettie's contract with him had insulated him from the commodity collapse, but just barely. She told him she needed more hogs, and she needed them within 2 years. Theodore told her he could do it, but he would need to expand his operation, and he did not have the capital. Nettie had the capital. She had been saving for 4 years against exactly this kind of opportunity, not this specific opportunity, but the class of opportunity that arrives when a crisis separates what is genuinely good from what is merely adequate. She lent Theodore Vance the money he needed at a fair interest rate with a handshake agreement that she would have first right to his expanded production for 5 years. Theodore's wife was in the room when they discussed the terms. She said very little. When Nettie left, she told Theodore that was the most sensible arrangement she had seen since her father sold his timber rights to a man who showed up with a dollar amount that matched the timber's actual value. Chet Dupree heard about the arrangement by November and told his wife that Nettie had got lucky again. Kay Bowman was 24 years old in the fall of 1989. She had finished 2 years at Eastern Kentucky and come home to run the order operation full-time, which had grown large enough to require full-time attention. She had her mother's precision and her father's quietness and something of her own that neither parent had exactly, a sense of what the market was doing and where it was going that was partly instinct and partly the result of reading everything she could find about food sourcing and restaurant economics. In October of 1989, Lot K brought Nettie a piece of paper with a list of numbers on it. If Theodore doubles his operation by 1991 and you expand the smokehouse again, she said, you can cure 400 hams a year. 400 was more than Nettie had ever thought about. 400 felt large in a way that made her cautious. You think the demand is there? Kay put the paper on the table. Look at the last 6 weeks. Nettie looked at the order book for the last 6 weeks of 1989. She looked at it for a while. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, your grandmother would have told me not to run out before February. Kay smiled. That's why I'm saying 400, not 600. Nettie looked at her daughter the way Georgia Reese had looked at her. Years ago, when Nettie had gotten the calculation exactly right. She was 62 years old that fall. She had been working at the smokehouse for more years than some of her customers had been alive. She had watched 2 generations of food trends move through American kitchens and had not followed any of them. She had not followed them because her mother had taught her that flavor was not a trend, that the specific taste of a well-cured ham was not something that went in and out of fashion the way hemlines did, that there was a permanent human appetite for real things done properly that no convenience product would ever fully replace. Jean Bowman died in March of 1991. Heart attack, sudden, the way things happen to steady men who have worked hard all their lives without asking for sympathy about it. He had seen the smokehouse grow from $400 worth of Eldon Price's equipment to a real operation. He had helped rebuild the south wall rack. He had driven the truck to Leslie County 6 times a year to pick up Theodore's hogs. He had not understood exactly what his wife was building, but he had understood her well enough to trust it, and that had been enough. Nettie worked 3 days after the funeral and came back to the smokehouse on the 4th. Kay did not tell her to, or tell her not to. July, she understood her mother well enough to know that the smokehouse was not where Nettie went to avoid grief. It was where she went to carry it somewhere it could be useful. By 1992, the waiting list was 2 years long. Nettie had stopped worrying about whether the demand was real. In the summer of 1993, she handed the daily operation of the smokehouse to Kay. Not because she was done with it, but because Kay had been running it in every practical sense for 3 years, and it was time for the paperwork to reflect what was already true. Nettie stayed involved. She walked the smokehouse every morning. She tasted every batch before it shipped. She drove to Leslie County with Kay once a year to walk Theodore's pastures and look at the hogs. But the decisions, the hires, the expansions, the chef relationships, those were Kay's. Kay expanded into a second facility in 1997. She opened a small retail space in Lexington in 2001. She began a program in 2004 to certify and support other small producers in Kentucky and Tennessee who wanted to cure meat the old way, pairing them with the same agricultural extension resources and the same supply chain relationships that had taken Nettie 30 years to build. Nettie went to the opening of the retail space in Lexington. She was 60 years old. She had never spoken publicly about her business in her life and had no intention of starting. But the store manager, a cheerful young woman who had grown up in Louisville and known nothing about country ham until Kay hired her, introduced Nettie to the small crowd that had gathered for the opening, and someone in the crowd asked Nettie how she had started. Nettie thought about it for a moment. "I learned from my mother," she said, "and she retired and I bought her teacher's equipment for $400. That was not quite what had happened, but it was as close as Nettie was willing to get to a public explanation, and the crowd seemed to understand it. Kay understood it completely. Later that night, after the crowd had gone and they were stacking boxes in the back of the new store, Kay said, "You could have told them the real story. Nettie was putting price tags on jars of rendered lard." "I did tell them the real story," she said. Kay thought about that for a moment. She had grown up watching her mother do things that looked simple from the outside and were not simple at all. The smokehouse on Clover Creek Road is still there. Kay rebuilt the chimney in 2005 and replaced the east side extension with a larger structure that her own daughter, Nettie's granddaughter, helped design. The order book that Kay started keeping in 1982 is in a filing cabinet in the original building, 12 volumes of it. Each one in Kay's handwriting from the early years and her daughter's handwriting from the later ones. The hams still come from Theodore Vance's farm, though Theodore retired in 2008 and his son runs it now. The Berkshire cross hogs still graze on pasture. The cure is still Nettie's formula, adjusted for the altitude and humidity of Harlan County, modified twice over the years in small ways that Nettie approved and initialed in the margin of the original notes she kept from the Virginia Tech monograph. In 2006, a food journalist from a national magazine drove down to Harlan County to write a long piece about the operation. He had been told about it by 3 different chefs in three different cities and had initially not believed that what they were describing could be coming from a smokehouse on a gravel road in eastern Kentucky. He spent 2 days at the facility and 1 afternoon with Nettie, who was 65 and living 10 minutes from the smokehouse, and still came in most mornings. He asked her what she had understood in 1979 that nobody else understood. Nettie was quiet for a moment. She was watching Kay walk the smokehouse floor, checking the hang of the current batch the way Nettie had taught her and the way Georgia had taught Nettie. I didn't understand anything nobody else could have understood, she said. The information was there. The Virginia Tech paper was in a library in Lexington that anyone could have visited. The Basque curers had been doing this for 500 years. The Italians had been doing it longer. All of it was there. I just read it and believed it. She paused. Most people read something that goes against what they're used to, and they think, well, that might be true somewhere else. I read it, and I thought, well, if it's true somewhere else, it's probably true here too. The journalist wrote the piece. It ran in October of 2006. The waiting list went to 3 years. Kay hired 2 more people. Nettie's granddaughter, who was 12 years old at the time, cut out the article and taped it to the wall of the original smokehouse, next to a photograph of Georgia Reese standing in front of her meat cellar in Pike County in 1953. 4 generations of women, each one adding to what she was given. Eldon Price had died in 1991, the same year as Jean Bowman. He had lived long enough to taste one of Nettie's finished hams and to tell her, in his kitchen, over coffee, that it was as good as his father's best work. He had not said it easily. He had turned the slice of ham over in his hands for a moment first, looking at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes from a long time ago. "Your salt ratio's a little high," he said. "I know," she said. "I run it high in winter." He nodded slowly. He did not argue. He had been arguing less as he got older and finding it more interesting to watch. "That is how it works," Nettie used to say, when she talked about what she had built, which was not often. 1 season at a time, 1 batch at a time. 1 person who tastes the real thing and cannot go back to the imitation. A what? Do you see when you look at a decommissioned smokehouse and 60 pounds of unwanted meat cuts? Most people see salvage. A problem the estate needs to solve. Equipment too old to compete, from a process too slow to be profitable, in a county that does not have the customer base to support it. An old man's life work with no one left to inherit it. Nettie Bowman saw a building that still held the right heat. Cuts from hogs that had been raised the old way by a man who had understood why the old way mattered. A tradition that had been running continuously in Harlan County since before anyone alive could remember, waiting for someone to take it seriously enough to do it right. She saw her mother's hands. She saw the Virginia Tech monograph. She saw a market that was hungry for something it did not have a name for yet. She saw $400 and a Saturday morning and 12 years of patience. Everyone else saw Eldon Price leftovers. That is the distance between what something looks like and what it is. Nettie Bowman paid $400 for a smokehouse nobody wanted. She cured meat by a method everyone had forgotten. She built a waiting list in a county where nobody thought the customers existed. She came through a national food scare with her order book, fuller than it had ever been, while her competitors closed their doors. She passed a living tradition to her daughter, who passed it to hers. They said nobody did artisan curing in Harlan County. Nettie did it. And when the crisis of 1989 finally arrived, not the doubt of 1979, not the slow years of 1981 and 1982, but the test that asked every small producer in America at once what they were actually selling and whether it was worth anything, they understood what Nettie had known from the beginning. A smokehouse is not a building. It is a body of knowledge that someone decided was worth keeping. $400. 60 pounds of Berkshire cuts. A rancher's daughter, who learned from a woman who learned from a woman who knew that some things do not improve when you make them faster.